Good morning. I am so pleased and honored to be here, and I thank you for inviting me to speak with you. This Federal Reserve Bank system and structure and the Center for Indian Country Development is an example, a beautiful example of what I want to talk about today in terms of institutional inclusion. And I really appreciate, Patrice, your leadership in this and so many things for Native people throughout the country. You have been paramount. We had an opportunity to catch up last night, and I learned even more about the very pivotal role Patrice has had in a number of major jurisdictional cases which continue to frame the rights of Native people and Native families. So as I speak today, it is with profound respect and appreciation for that record of leadership, as well as our colleagues in the field who've worked over decades in federal Indian law to actually create a space for tribal governance within the U.S. federal system. So in my remarks today, I want to focus on the role of institutions in promoting inclusion, and I am going to speak with attention to the role of institutions, but also how inclusion plays out in the workplace. So I actually view what happens in the workplace with inclusion as a microcosm today of many of the powerful social changes that are happening in society, which really require us to develop new ways of doing business. And when I talk about the partnerships between federal, state, and tribal governments, this is a very creative space for innovation in institutional inclusion. So my central message to you this morning is that as society becomes more diverse, we actually must transform our institutions to reflect what I call an ethics of inclusion. And that requires a new way of engaging practices and intercultural communication and competence, which is what I refer to as the art of inclusion. And I'm going to draw some of those examples for you in this lecture. So I've divided the presentation into roughly four parts, which I'm actually used to just talking, but my student actually helped me prepare this. And he is responsible for finding pictures of Indian country. So my starting place is always to say that every single inch of this country is Indian country, and that there are very powerful stories embedded in places that deal with people. And again, Patrice filled me in a bit about this part of the world, which this is my first real visit to. So I was very grateful for that. But I'm from the Southwest. I'm Yaqui on my dad's side, and I'm married to the Navajo Nation. So a lot of the pictures that I use and my experience comes from the Southwest. So there's Red Mountain, which is a sacred place on the Salt River, Pima, Maricopa Indian community, which is adjacent to what is now Scottsdale and, of course, the greater Phoenix area. So I'll be talking about the art of inclusion, about the practice of building inclusive institutions, and then I want to situate those comments within the historical context, because to talk about inclusion really requires having an understanding of history. And then I'll talk about some of the contemporary challenges to inclusion and loop back into a discussion about the work that I understand that you're engaged with, but I would like to have a conversation with you. And then I'll offer some thoughts on what is being framed as cultural competency in some circles. At the University of Arizona, they prefer to talk about it as cultural literacy, things that we learn and going forward, because obviously cultural competency suggests that you can be incompetent, which we don't want to tell our students. We want to keep them moving forward. So as I prepared to do this presentation, and this was very present for me last year, I read an article that came out just last fall, and it was sort of a statement that the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco president, John Williams, said at a conference that he was attending. And he said, and this is his quote, "The financial services industry and the Federal Reserve are not as diverse as they should or need to be." And he said, "Diverse perspectives lead to better thinking and better outcomes." He stressed that the bank serves the interests of all Americans, in particular the minority communities that struggle with fewer job opportunities. And consistent with that, he was speaking about, in the workplace, his perception that diversity was especially lacking at the ranks of middle management, and that there was an attempt to change that by creating a diversity council composed of bank leaders that would be coordinating and promoting inclusion efforts. The last thing he said is, "There is no place for bastions of privilege in the financial sector, the government, the tech sector, or any other important segment of our economy and society." That statement was very important to me on many levels because he was looking critically at his institution and the workforce, but also mapping onto what was happening in society and imagining different structures that could actually accomplish that. So I wanted to start the presentation with respect for what he said, and I'll be drawing on it throughout the presentation. But as we come back to that, I want to have a discussion with you about how that structure is working or if it's developed, because that's a very exciting thing for me. In terms of what I'm framing as the art of inclusion sort of situated against contemporary dynamics, the very important thing for me is that in every sector of society, we realize that we all have these common shared interests. And so, for example, in Arizona, the work that I'm engaged in with federal, state, and tribal governments revolves around community health. There's a needs assessment process at the state level that until very recently did not interface at all with the tribal level, because that was perceived to be under federal law, right? The Native American health care system. So why should the counties actually work there? Well, when they started to work together, they realized several important features, including pandemic planning, that would actually require some level of coordination. Education, that's a primary one. And here, many students in Arizona from reservation communities attend state schools. Most of the schools that they attend are in the category which is rated in Arizona as underperforming and under-resourced. So there aren't the same opportunities and there are not the same outcomes, and yet that is a state structure that is populated predominantly by Native children in those areas. Again, a need to work together. Environment. We all breathe the same air. We all use the same water. Water resources very scarce in the Southwest. The level of change with climate incidents is becoming more and more severe. So for example, in a recent study that some researchers did in Arizona, the number of climate-related deaths had a disproportionate impact on Native and Latino people due to the types of jobs and their exposure to dust and severe climate, as well as lack of ready access to services when there are heat-related illnesses. So again, these are things that we see in relationship to populations as disparate impacts. Law enforcement, that is one that I'll talk about in the presentation, because there are jurisdictional challenges, because many of the reservation communities are right next to the state, right? Scottsdale, Phoenix. Crimes can start one place, end another place. You can have victims and defendants of either population. So we have to have our judicial institutions and our law enforcement institutions able to coordinate. And of course, when we talk about food security, that is a major issue, again, in an era of climate. So we're looking at vulnerability of populations given food deserts that exist and the resilience of populations in those areas. So those are the issues that we need to look at in terms of the current context, in terms of demographics, in terms of the impact on populations. What is our current climate? And here I'm not talking about climate change type of climate. I'm talking about political climate around the issues of diversity and inclusion. After the election in 2016, we saw a huge division in social circumstances and a variety of incidents across the university, but even the K through 12 school system, where students were reporting hate crimes, hate speech, the DACA students' feelings that they didn't belong, the Native students being mistaken for DACA students, all types of issues with the student. So the context was very hypercharged. In the wake of things like Black Lives Matter, the incidents in Ferguson, so we have all of these national events happening, and the conversation around diversity and inclusion can be very contentious. That inspires two responses among institutions, and here I'm talking broadly speaking. One response is to look at the political context of your state and say, you know what, I actually don't think we should talk about diversity. Maybe if we don't talk about it, people can just get along, and we don't need to highlight bad things. That's one response. That's not my response, by the way. I don't believe in that response. So the other response is to say, you know what, we have to talk about it, because the evidence shows us that the more you keep populations separate, and we no longer have formal segregation, but we have profound residential segregation in many parts of the country due to economic circumstances. And you bring together students in the university that never had to encounter each other K through 12 or in their community. They don't know how to talk to each other. So how can we promote what may be termed a safe space in education for people to come together but not be afraid of contentious issues, really engage that? That requires what I'm calling the art of inclusion. Now, in the demographic shift that we see in the United States, and this is going to what is on the horizon, this is out of the 2016 Pew Research Center study, where they actually indicated a number of demographic trends, and the populations that they found were most expanding were Latino and Asian populations. They said that 43% of the millennials, people that were born after 1980, are non-white, and that is the highest share of any generation. We certainly see that in the Southwest, that the curve is really, it's a young population, and the K through 12 system is a majority minority system in Arizona as it is in Texas, probably since about 2010. So that's the national demographic. Of the national figures, of course, American Indian and Alaska Native people represent a relatively small segment of society. So according to their study, they designated the U.S. population as 61% white as of this time, 12% black, 18% Hispanic, 6% Asian, and 1.9% American Indian / Alaska Native. And of course, that number can shift depending on what the criteria are used. But what that means for us is that oftentimes the Native population is not factored into the big studies, for example, on discrimination or, employment discrimination, things like that, because it's so small that people are afraid that they won't get an accurate sample. So a lot of times that is called the invisible population in terms of inclusion, which is why I'm delighted to be here today talking to you and that you're interested and working on those issues in the center. So diversity doesn't necessarily lead to inclusion. And that's the first thing to realize, right? So society can get more and more and more diverse, but you're not going to have inclusion unless you do specific things to create the circumstances. So that is what I want to focus with you today. Now, we have several troubling trends to deal with. So first of all, as the bank president in San Francisco said, Mr. Williams, the top echelons of society are not diverse. And so when I looked at all of the studies, and I won't, repeat those with you because I think you're aware of those, but just about every level, if you look at the highest positions in government, the federal courts, banks and financial institutions, Hollywood studios, corporations in the Silicon Valley, and the partners in America's top law firms, that is not a diverse group in any of those sectors. And women and members of racial minorities are not prominently represented at the top level, even though they really are the majority of society. The other troubling trend is that there continue to be these widespread disparities in the circumstances. So today we're looking at, for example, health disparities, right? We're looking at mortality rates, rates of disease, all of these things, early diagnosis, treatment potential, all of that. It turns out that the most important factor are the social indicators of health. Your social and economic circumstances are determinative in ways that genetic composition or other things are not. So we really have to spend more time talking about that. And the third, of course, is that, and this is true nationally, racial intolerance is on the rise. So we had some good years in the civil rights era where people were talking about equality and promoting that in an affirmative manner. Today, we don't see that. And so, for example, in Phoenix alone, FBI statistics said that hate crimes spiked 26% in the year 2015. So when they did their 2016 study. It's a huge amount in that 1 year period. So we see intolerance on the border issues, but that does bleed over and affect many people in Arizona. Setting an aspirational goal for inclusion, I think, is pivotal in terms of the practice. And what I'm framing as the art of inclusion is a process of transforming practices and institutions to create the conditions for effective governmental partnerships, federal, state, and tribal, around the key issues that affect all of society. And I've just listed the few that I started with. We have to promote a different way of looking at the ethics of doing business across cultures and groups. And we also have to pay attention to inclusive practices. It turns out that one of the most important things to do is to be very specific about terminology. So the terminology that we're using about diversity and the terminology that we're using about inclusion are oftentimes lumped together with a preference for inclusion because it sounds more friendly, right? Diversity oftentimes is off-putting to people because it sounds like difference, and we don't really want to get into that, at least in Arizona terms. Maybe that doesn't happen here. The idea of diversity does focus to some extent on difference, but it also has a problematic history. And that's the importance of social context. So today, the forces that rail against diversity see it as a divisive force that threatens political unity. And so you can see that, for example, in some of the school systems, they don't want you to teach too much about this. They want you to focus on that, so that students won't get that sense of divisive relations. In Arizona, we have a constitutional amendment that banned consideration of race or gender in employment, in educational opportunities at state institutions. So that's the level that we are working with at the state level there. But it's interesting to me to see how much American society values diversity in other contexts, right? You value diversity in the cars that you drive. You value diversity in artwork, in music, in food. What would a university be if you didn't have a diversity of disciplines represented in all of those levels of knowledge? Biodiversity, everybody wants to preserve the species because biodiversity is a good thing. So if we value diversity in every single thing except people, what is that telling us? So one of the things that it's telling us is that there is a resistance to identity. And the resistance to identity may be framed in terms of the colorblind ideology that color doesn't matter, everybody's equal. We don't see race as a constitutional matter. Is that true? The Constitution is colorblind. How many people think that's true? The Constitution should be colorblind, right? If equality means anything, it should be colorblind. But people, which constitute our society, people aren't colorblind. They're always going to look at each other and they're going to make an assessment about who or what the other person is. It may or may not be correct. But they'll make an assessment and then there will be values attached to that. And one of the things that I always make my students do is to I say, close your eyes and picture a truck driver. Does a truck driver have a gender? What's his gender? Male. Does a truck driver have a race? What's the truck driver's race? Does a truck driver have a social economic context? Would he be sipping fine wine or would he have a Budweiser beer? Okay, so, and then my students all do what you guys just did. They all do that. And they say, where did that come from? So those are schema, right? The things that are embedded because we've seen so many of these movies and society is so it spoofs on these things. So we have these schema and they sit back there and lots of times they're used for humor or, people connect the way that we just did here. But there are many of those and they map onto many different groups in many different ways. And so that's the first time to think of that. And so I tell my students, those are the unconscious parts of our mental apparatus around race and gender, right? Unconscious bias, sometimes it's called, but people don't like to think that they're biased because as soon as you call it to their attention, then they wake up and they're like, okay, But what do we do with this concept of diversity? And so what I do in my work is to promote diversity as a beneficial resource the way all other types of diversity are. And this requires getting people to think about what the arguments are that they're making for diversity. And there are 3 standard arguments, and I don't know how this maps onto what you have thought about it. But one is the public good argument, and I think that that is what Mr. Williams was talking about with the Federal Reserve, that diversity of perspectives comes from diversity of employees, and you're going to have better outcomes for society, and you're going to create a better institution, more innovative. People will bring these things to the mix, and so diversity in the workforce is actually beneficial. So that's the public good argument. Number 2 is the business argument, that you can't compete effectively in a global society if you don't have diversity. And here there was one of the leadership in the U.S. military was making that argument that that's what the military perspective is, right? So they need diversity because they're doing business globally. They need to understand how people think and to be able to work effectively. The moral argument is the argument that basically says it's the right thing to do because for much of the nation's history there was formal exclusion, hierarchies of rights, so it's the right thing to do. That's the basis for the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. People don't like that argument. They do not like that argument because it really inspires them to feel guilty about things that they had no part in creating, and that's why if you poll Americans, that is their least favorite argument about diversity. I want to add a 4th one to the mix for you to think about, and that is what I call the Prudential Argument, which basically says, given the population shift that is happening in the U.S. and happening right now, it's the collective interest of all of us to see ourselves as a diverse society and a united society. Diverse and united. And that is the argument that I want to make here, that the majority can become a minority within a generation. And the interest of any minority is in equality of treatment, right? That we are diverse and we are one. Okay, that's a little bit on diversity. Inclusion, to me, is a process of creating a shared sense of the value of those diverse identities and a sense of belonging so that people do feel that they have equal respect, equal rights to belong, and they will enjoy equal opportunities no matter where they go in society because people will see that diversity is a benefit. That would be the optimal result. So the work of inclusion does require an ethics, a way of doing business across cultures, and also a set of practices. One of the practices that I recommend to institutions is a process of self-assessment, and that is looking at their composition in terms, or diversity in terms of the composition, which is the numbers, representational, the proportions, that's different than numbers. Are the proportions similar to society, different than society, your local region? Behavioral, how do people interface in the workforce? Do they sit together? Do they hang out together? Are they separate? How do they behave? And psychological, how do they feel? Do they feel included? Do they feel excluded? Are they comfortable? What does that look like? And with that, you will have many opportunities to do some work in the data and have a greater understanding of the institution. The other practice that I think is very important is to be aware of what the barriers are within the institutional context to inclusion. What are the barriers? And that does require 2 things. Number 1, understanding the historical context, and it often varies from region to region. And number 2, understanding how the dynamics are within that region today about how to promote participatory access across the board. So those two things are one of the best practices in terms of promoting that goal, the art of inclusion. So for Native people, and this is going to be obviously the substantive context of the lecture, and here I'm just going to highlight some things and then bring it up to the current day. But the historical context is actually very, very important for Native people. Today, as I mentioned, Native people are about 1.9% of the American population, but they are constituted as members of 567 federally recognized tribes which have a distinctive political status. They are sovereign governments. They pre-existed the United States government, and they are not part of the constitutional bargain. So the Constitution is a bargain between the federal government and the states, and that I'm talking about the original Constitution and the amended Constitution after the Civil War. It was the states and the federal government. The sovereign nations, the tribal governments, had to weather the storms of U.S. constitutional vagaries and the Civil War. They're still weathering those storms. But they pre-existed the United States government. So they, in that sense, are more like foreign nations. And they have important treaty relationships. Many of the tribes have important treaty relationships that are enduring relationships with the United States government and with Great Britain before the United States government. The 1778 treaty between the United States and the Delaware Nation was the very first Indian treaty, and if you look at that treaty, it basically, the United States is saying, you are a foreign nation that could choose to align with Great Britain or choose to align with us. We're asking you to be our friend, our ally, and we will ask permission to go across your land. So it is like a foreign treaty. Today, there are continuing issues with treaty rights. The Dakota Access Pipeline, that was in the national eye. That 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty still, it embodies a recognition of the ancestral ties of the various Lakota nations to that land, that place, and the cultural sites that are on that land. And then, of course, there's an intervening history which defined the reservation communities. So very often, the reservations of today are not part of that ancestral homeland. So how would the nations protect their cultural sites on those lands, right? They're no longer in tribal jurisdiction. There are 322 Indian reservations in the United States. About 59 million acres of land is trust land. The United States holds legal title, the tribes hold beneficial title, and that is in a separate jurisdictional regime from the rest of the country. All federally recognized tribes have what we call a trust relationship with the United States. So that United States has the duty to protect tribal sovereignty and tribal lands, and that relationship authorizes federal law on a variety of topics that normally would be part of the police powers of the state. So a good one is the Indian Child Welfare Act, right? Normally, domestic relations is within the state. The states were behaving very badly with Native families for a long time, resulting in the loss of Native children. So that statute is Congress basically saying, we're going to fix that history and give you jurisdiction over placement of those Indian children when they go into foster care or adoption. That's what we're talking about with that federal relationship. All American Indian and Alaska Native governments today have sovereignty, but they also enjoy the human right of self-determination as peoples, and that's embedded in the 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Obama administration signed on to that on behalf of the United States. That document in human rights law says Indigenous peoples are peoples like any other with the right of self-determination, which is autonomy over their political, social, economic, and cultural relations. So that is who the tribes are today. However, their rights are affected by 5 eras of society. And I just published a recent article on this, and it's very long and has tons of footnotes. So if there's anything you are particularly interested in, I'll be happy to share the article with Patrice and all of you. But I'm just going to highlight, because this is in effect a sort of schizophrenia that the United States has, because it formulates policy in all of these various eras from 1776 to 2017. There have been these 5 levels of policy. They are all still operative to some extent, but oftentimes they're misunderstood so that people actually don't even know what the rights are that Native people have or why they have those special rights. So, category 1, American Indian people started as citizens of separate nations, right? That's the sort of the bedrock of federal Indian law, that treaty relationship, the idea of a domestic dependent nation under federal protection. Treaty making was concluded by Congress in 1871. So that treaty period is period 1. The treaties are still good law if they have not been specifically abrogated by the United States government. So that continues to some extent, but our frame of thinking about the rights of Native nations is different now because we have come to the view that they are now incorporated into this thing called the United States, which is period 2. American Indians as wards of the United States government was the policy era from the late 19th century as the tribes were removed in Oklahoma Indian Territory. That was a popular place to remove the tribes from the east to the west, make the reservations smaller. Well, the status of a ward, Congress said you couldn't make treaties with them. They weren't capable of making treaties anymore after 1871. But they also were not United States citizens unless they were naturalized by a specific law. So for example, if an Indian woman married a non-Indian man, became civilized, and was incorporated into his household, she could get naturalized to citizenship under one of those late 19th century statutes. But so there were little ways that they could get there, but not broad-based. What that meant is that they had no civil rights to speak of, and that is why the United States government could do things like forcibly remove Indian children to boarding schools to be civilized, prevent them from speaking native languages upon pain of punishment. The federal government banned, under federal administrative law, the practice of indigenous religions, confiscated sacred objects, which is why so many objects ended up in federal museums and collections. There was a Surgeon General's order to gather Native bodies on the battlefields and bring them back to Washington to be studied. So they were humans of some form, but certainly had no equal civil rights as wards. That period lasted until 1924, and Patrice just talked about the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, which was very important because Congress said across the board, all American Indians are now citizens, but it kept all of the treaty rights, that saved the treaty rights, so they were citizens of their tribal nation and citizens of the United States. The states freaked out because they didn't want Indians voting or whatever. The Indians lived on the reservation in the Southwest. You didn't want them, voting if they didn't pay property taxes and things like that. So the whole struggle in the civil rights era was to get equal rights, and that's why I put that up. Citizens of the United States and the states where they reside. That was the legacy of the civil rights era, to actually gain equal rights to educational opportunity, to voting rights. The fourth period, Indians as racial minorities, this was the discourse in the 1970s and 1980s about civil rights, measuring accounts of discrimination. And here I'm going to just call your attention to a recent poll that was done by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Harvard School of Public Health. They did a poll and they found that Native people today, this was just released a few days ago, about 55% of Native people have experienced racial or ethnic discrimination when interacting with law enforcement or applying for jobs. 55%. And the worst accounts were accounts where, for example, in border communities, the Native population is highly visible and distinctive. There were less reports, it went down about 25% if they were part of a major metropolitan urban area where they're not prominently featured. So the racial disparities continue in health, education, voting rights across the board. And the fifth category is the one that I talked about, the human rights framing of Native nations as peoples with a right to self-determination. Now, what is the upshot of that? So these are some areas that we can talk about and you know, we can have more discussion because obviously my time is rapidly coming to a close. But in terms of economics and inclusion, this is the importance of the Center for Indian Country Development. I am not aware of any other institution that has been so effective at looking at the financial markets, and I think part of that is, frankly, this idea of the community development institutions that is featured into the Federal Reserve Bank, but separating out Indian country as an area to look at. And the way that you have designed it, to my mind, is exactly what needs to be done. You are building relationships with tribal nations, which basically foster a level of engagement and respect from tribal governments to the Federal Reserve Bank, and looking at the financial markets, looking at disparities, and tying that into the pipeline issues in terms of education and looking at health, at housing, at wellness. All of that is very, very powerful in your work. So that's a primary example of something going right, and we need to then build that at the state level, right? So that things are instituted within each of the regions. Education and inclusion, I talked about. There are many things we could talk about. K through 12 pipeline programs. This is basically my world, is education, and I have lots of hope for the future because these are amazing students and schools. But I also have a healthy respect for the disparities that I'm seeing in Arizona. The gap is growing wider in terms of those disparities because most of those kids are in public school. They can't go to a private school, and they are less prepared to go to college today. Land and resources and inclusion, this is an area of my research that I'm very excited about. I'm looking at the work of climate, but also looking at how Native knowledge and epistemologies are represented in environmental decision making. So on the negative side, things to work on, challenges to work on, the pipelines, the Dakota Access Pipeline and everything that is happening right now shows you what happens when you lack inclusion. The tribal governments were not consulted about where those pipelines are going. That is a huge piece of infrastructure that is impacting tribal communities, but was perceived not to impact them unless it directly impaired a federally protected land or water resource. So that's on the negative side. On the positive side, the Bears Ears National Monument, which may be in some political jeopardy right now, but putting that aside, President Obama did proclaim that national monument under the Antiquities Act, the first time ever that a national monument recognized the contemporary significance to current tribal governments and their historic preservation offices, and said indigenous knowledge is part of the understanding of what that site is, and set up a tribal advisory council structure to work with the three federal agencies that are involved in the management of that area. A first, and it is inclusion in the system that we have about national monuments. And then finally, I actually am very sort of concerned, I guess, about Native children and families kind of in the larger scheme of things. And this is why the relationships with the states are so important. Native elderly, a very vulnerable population. The young people, also a very vulnerable population, but oftentimes not seen or counted because the services rendered may be off reservation, not on reservation. And so those are issues where the state and tribal governments have to work together. I love the focus on wellness. So again, on the negative, we can talk about health disparities, vulnerability. On the positive, think about resilience. These are communities that have survived through events that have been almost catastrophic in histories. They have profound resilience, cultural ways of knowing, and kinship that really promote survival and flourishing. And that is a quality that is being spoken about now as resilience. So what do I see in terms of intercultural communication? And here, I'm not going to go into the techniques. That's another presentation. But with federally recognized tribal governments, there is a need for consultation. That's a legal need to consult with tribal governments around issues that are deemed to affect them. You have to know what affects them, and you have to know them before you can engage in consultation. So that's why the work that you're doing, it's promoting the relationships and the knowledge so that you can meet the legal mandate. The legal mandate alone will not do the trick. And so I see that happening across the nation as agencies struggle to understand what consultation requires and what it needs. And what it needs is basically a different ethics of inclusion. So that ties into inclusion for the workplace, and I can have more to say about that in question and answer time. I know that I have talked for a very long time, and I'm anxious to talk to you about any of the issues that you are seeing, and I do appreciate your time this morning. Thank you so much.
Okay, I have a handheld mic. Anybody want to get us started with a good question for Rebecca? All right, Benjamin.
I have a question about your ethics of inclusion. I think the fourth sort of pillar you mentioned, you called the prudential pillar, about the idea that we will soon be a majority-minority country, and we need to really reconcile that with the current disparities that exist. I feel like I've read a lot of great thinking and work on that, but there's kind of a nascent pushback developing, which is this idea that the majority and concepts like whiteness have also changed over time, and there might be a danger in that we might just be transitioning to a world where there's a different majority that also fails to properly access a prosperous society through diverse and inclusive measures. I'm wondering if you share that concern, and if you have any thoughts on it and the work to be done to maybe prevent or push back on that.
That is a wonderful question. And so actually what that suggests to me is that oftentimes we may lack fundamental agreement on the baseline. So for example, if you look at who is the wealthiest, right? The wealthiest people who enjoy the access to the most benefits, that group really is narrowing. They own more and more and more of the resources, but their numerical percentage is actually very small. So in a sense, they're a minority, but they have a majority share of resources. And so here we're looking by class, right? The expanding deficit in terms of middle class, access of middle class people, right, to housing and health and things like that. And there is that discussion, so not linked to race, but more linked to class. And that has promoted some people to say, well, we need to think of race more as class and more as a political project and things of that nature. So I do, in a sense, accept the notion that we need to look at what good we're talking about or what package of goods we're talking about and how we're measuring the quote-unquote minority and the quote-unquote majority. So that's a very thoughtful, point that I would like to promote. When I talk about race, in a sense, I'm noting that if you look by racial group, the disparities continue to be profound and growing in some sense. So the least advantaged members of society, even if they turned out to be the majority, they would still be the least advantaged. And there we need to look at the other things that affect their opportunity, things that we may not want to talk about, like bias, stereotyping, exclusion in ways that are permissible, right? Because we don't want overt discrimination. We never want that. But we could have more covert forms that are totally acceptable because they're invisible. And the legal tests are set up now to say, well, if it was overt discrimination, you can't do that. But if it's just a disparate impact, could be attributed to a lot of things, not necessarily discrimination, and therefore not actionable. So there was a lot in your observation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Do we have another question?
I was going to say, I have one if, Ron, okay.
So in your role as the advisor to folks at the university who have got accountability for D&I, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think you've done at the university that have been most successful that were different or new or that, not as common and not as commonly found other places?
Well, I'm not going to take any personal credit for anything at the University of Arizona because I've only been there for a year. So in that year, they had the foresight to start an office with a full-time staff administrator, and there is active work going on, training with all levels, faculty, students, staff, promoting conversation. I have been at the policy level dealing with external communities on the level that I'm engaging with you about institutional practices. And in a sense, I'm in that living matrix, right? Because we have a board of regents, which has a certain role. We have a legislature, which has a certain role. These are the dynamics that all institutions have to grapple with. So I am bringing those lessons kind of largely and having a conversation with other groups. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for your comments here this morning. You talked about the 5 stages of inclusion and diversity. Could you talk about where you think things are trending? It looks as though we've sort of, morphed over time. Where do you think we're going?
So for Native nations, in terms of those 5 levels of citizenship, which is basically the matrix for inclusion, right, is as citizens, but it's not just one thing. So for example, what Native tribal governments are seeing right now is that backlash, that kind of railing against diversity and things like that has an effect because a lot of times these people want to dismantle tribal programs. So there was an attack, a constitutional attack on the Indian Child Welfare Act saying, it's a colorblind society. Why can tribes have an Indian preference for where their children go? I mean, we should give kids the greatest set of opportunities and we can't be looking at race. So see, that racial discourse does affect tribal rights. And again, where we're going is the language of self-determination, that these tribal governments have powerful histories, ways of knowing, epistemologies, legal systems, governance systems, and that can be a benefit for all of society. So for example, rural health, always problematic, no matter who you are. Tribal governments have the capacity to have health distribution services. You could get a better quality of health if a tribal government is developing an institution than you might otherwise. And, the identity, to the extent that the provider doesn't have to be, any particular government, although I understand that healthcare has its own, set of challenges. But employment, casinos, one of the primary employers in Arizona now, primary contributor to the economy, services, industry sector. The tribal governments have been very important for all of those things. So inclusion as governments, not merely as racial minorities.
All right. With that, I think we have to say thank you to Rebecca Tsosie for coming here today, to sharing with us her vision for diversity and inclusion as an institution. I know there are many good lessons that we can think about and apply to our own work here. And I just want everyone to say, give her a great round of applause for her contributions.